How did you learn to be such a bold stylist?
I don't know. I don't know that I learned to be a bold stylist. I just don't think the law has to be dull. I think writing should be interesting to the extent that it can be. And I think legal writing did not follow that prescription. In my earlier days as a lawyer, before regression analysis took over the economic science, economic writing was so much more interesting than legal writing. There was not extensive footnoting. There were just references at the end of the piece, and it was written in a conversational, interesting style. I don't know how we got off that track, but it's a scary thought to think that economists were more interesting than lawyers. It doesn't have to be dull, and I think it's to the extent that the writer can do so. I think he has an obligation to make what he writes interesting, if possible. And that can be done even with some relatively dry subjects. It especially can be done in our legal system. I mean, one of the wonderful things about American legal opinions is that they are the opinions of a single identified author, so that he can put some of himself or herself into it. He can generate interest in that fashion, as opposed to, if you ever read any of the opinions of foreign courts that are drafted by committee or that are very formulary, whereas, that's terrible, dull, dry stuff. Ours does not have to be that.
You think conversational is good?
No, there has to be a certain dignity and weight to the opinion, but that doesn't rule out an occasional witticism or a pun or something of that sort.
What are the characteristics of a good legal style?
Well, they're number one, be literate. And, that's pretty basic, such as not saying cite to, and such as using an apostrophe before a participle that's used as a noun. There is a difference between I saw him coming and I saw his coming. And increasingly I read briefs where they never put an apostrophe before the noun form of the verb. And that's terrible. Again, it makes it impossible to convey that difference between I saw him coming and I saw his coming. Beyond pure literacy, avoid legalese. There are all sorts of, the instant case. I said in one of my speeches, or I wrote somewhere, a good test is if you use the word at a cocktail party, would people look at you funny? You talked about the instant case or the instant problem. And it's ridiculous. It's legalese. This case would do very well. Another one of my bête noire legalisms is nexus. Yeah, nexus. What is it? It's Latin for connection. You don't make it more scientific at all by calling it a nexus. What else besides being grammatical, avoiding legalese? Avoid trendiness. That's probably the other extreme of legalese. I never ever use, nor let my law clerks use, such trendy expressions as, the First Amendment informs our consideration of this. The first time that was used, that was very nice. It was a nice metaphor, but it has lost all of its vividness, and it's just can't. Another example of the same is Marbury versus Madison and its progeny. That was wonderful the first time it was used. It is trite now, terribly trite. Get some other expression.
What do you think about the law review author who wrote about Roe versus Wade and its progeny? What do you think of footnotes?
I know that you and I differ on this, and you will probably have the last word with your charges, but I think footnotes are useful. For one thing, when you draft a majority opinion for a court, whether it's a court of appeals or the Supreme Court, the majority circulates, and sometimes there is a dissent. I think a dissent should be answered. Now, not every judge thinks that. I mean, there is the magisterial approach. You just move on, to not even dignify the dissent with a response. I don't think that's right, and I think you should answer the dissent. It can ruin the flow of your argument if you have to include, some of the points are quite intricate. If you have to include a lengthy discussion of this or that right in the middle of the progression of your argument, it's awfully nice to put as much of that as you can in a footnote. The dissent says that this point is incorrect because, and then you respond to the dissent in the footnote. That is probably the most useful function of a dissent, of a footnote. And the only other things I put down there are things that are worth saying, but again would interrupt the flow of your argument. The flow of the argument is very important. A good stylist, I use a lot of words that tell the reader where you're going. You should always signal the reader. Two sentences. Let's see. He was a good writer. He was not always accurate. I mean, you could say those two sentences, but the reader would know where you're going. You say, he was a good writer, but he was not always accurate. And those little words, but and, however, they send a signal. This is where I'm going now. I'm not hitting this. I'm giving the other side. I think good writers use those signals.
Why do you begin so many sentences with and but?
I think partly for that reason, signaling the reader. And it's just, I'm coming up with another reason for the same point. But is now, I'm showing the other side.
And you like but at the beginning of a sentence better than however?
I love but at the beginning of the sentence, and I never put however at the beginning, almost never put however. I think however, I think it belongs after the word that it is intended to set apart. That is not true, however, for such and such, rather than however, that is not true. That is not true, however. I would much rather say it that way. Maybe that's a peculiar part of my own style, but I don't think you'll often find sentences in mine that begin with a however.
And a lot of lawyers prefer in addition to and consequently to so, and notwithstanding to but. Always the heavy words. It's part of legalese, isn't it?
It is part of legalese, of course it is. Of course it is.
What do you
Beyond the peradventure of a doubt. That's one of my favorite legaleses.
You don't say peradventure.
I never say beyond the peradventure of a doubt. Peradventure is one of those words you wouldn't use at a cocktail party. Get rid of it.
Or if you do, people drift away from you.
Or we look at you funny.
What do you think of the writing in law reviews?
It has most of the defects that we've been discussing. Perhaps in an even higher degree, because the lawyers-to-be are showing off their legalese, their legal talents. And of course, the writing is much too heavily footnoted. Much too heavily footnoted.
When we first sat down to talk about doing this interview, you mentioned that there's a word to describe people like you who care a lot about words. I think the word is snoot.
Yes, and you knew the acronym for that better than I did, and the author who developed the term, neither of which I recall. But
David Foster Wallace.
There you are, David Foster Wallace. But there are people who care a lot about words, about precise use of words, and there are people who don't. And snoots are those who are nitpickers for le mot juste, for using a word precisely the way it should be used, not dulling it by misuse.
You think
I'm a snoot. I confess. I guess a more old-fashioned word for snoot is pedant. I hope I'm not a pedant. I mean, I will end a sentence with a preposition. I don't believe in those hobgoblins. But I do believe in not misusing words and using apostrophes where good English calls for them. Things of that sort. I acquired it in part from my father. Can I tell the story?
Absolutely.
My father was a linguist. He taught Romance languages at Brooklyn College. He used to read my opinions when I was on the Court of Appeals and correct my grammar and any language. We used to, the D.C. Circuit used to conclude all its opinions with a formula. For the foregoing reasons, it is hereby ordered, solid caps, that the judgment of the district court is affirmed or is reversed. This used to drive my father up the wall. He would write me, son, you cannot order that it is affirmed. You have to use the subjunctive. It is hereby ordered that it be affirmed. So I ended up being the only judge on the D.C. Circuit who wrote it is hereby ordered that the judgment of the district court be affirmed. But I don't think that's pedantry. I think that is snoot, but it is preserving the purity of the language.
Are there any other snoots on the court?
I think, the biggest snoot on the court used to be Harry Blackman. And Harry and I joined forces to try to police the court's opinions. On the current court, I think David Souter's a snoot. And I don't think Ruth is too she's too polite to be a snoot, but she cares a lot about proper use of the mother tongue.
Do you think it'd be a good thing if more lawyers became snoots?
Oh, absolutely. I cannot imagine why any lawyer would not be a snoot. It's the tools of your trade, man. It's what you work with. Why do you want to abuse them?